So we're looking at hope today, and we're looking at the theme of hope as part of our new series in Advent. And Spurgeon, who was a very famous preacher, said, "God's promises are longer than life, broader than sin, deeper than the grave, and higher than the clouds." And last week we were looking at hope, and we were really looking at why we can have hope in Jesus, and why God is worthy of his words, why we can trust that what he says is true. So if you missed out on that, please try and catch up with that talk, because actually what we are talking about today about promises makes sense if we can trust God for what he says, if we have hope that actually what he says will happen. So it would make sense to kind of see that, understand that before we go into promises. But I think hopefully most of us would agree that God is true for his word, that he will do what he said he would do. But the question is obviously, what has God promised? Did he promise a happily ever after kind of story? What did God promise us? So that's what we're going to look into today. And if you look at the Old Testament especially, and even the New Testament, prophecies and promises were always given in times of hardship, when there was darkness, when they didn't really know what to do, when they were lost, when they were under persecution, when they were desperate. Then God would send a prophet and say, actually, look guys, I know you are finding it really difficult, but not everything's lost. I am with you, and there's a future for you. So that's a context always of prophecies, and that's the context in which God has given prophecies. Because actually if we look at 1 Corinthians 14, it says, "But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging and comfort." And it's a bit like when I'm with my kids and they are going through something difficult or they're sad, we kind of promise something, which is something we're very happy to do and probably would do anyways, but because they're having a hard time, we kind of remind them this is what's going to happen. If they're a bit bored, you say, well, remember that on Saturday we're going to do this. Or if they're kind of a bit down, you say, well, remember you're going to get a chocky at night, or you're going to get a Christmas present in a few days. It's kind of that when you see that they're down, you just remind them of something that they probably have forgotten or they're not aware about, but which was always in your heart to give. And I think that's what happens with God's promises. It was always in his heart to do everything he's going to do. He just reminds people throughout history for them to kind of have a bit of encouragement when they're finding things difficult. So if you look at the context in Isaiah is speaking in a very difficult context, and he says he's called by God to be his voice, to speak God's words to the people around him. And it's important for us to remember this, that God called Isaiah to speak to his people. In Isaiah 6, which is an amazing passage, it says, God says, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And I said, this is Isaiah saying, "Here I am, send me. Go and tell this people." And then God starts speaking to him. So that's Isaiah's call. And if we look at the passage just before the one we're going to read in a while, in Isaiah 8, we find that actually they're not listening to God. They're listening to all these random people saying random things, and that's why they've lost hope and they've lost a perspective of where they're supposed to go. We read in Isaiah 8, verse 19, just before the passage we're going to read now, it says, "When someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living?" So basically we see that the people were hearing news that was fake news and not going to God to kind of find hope and a real perspective in their lives. So bearing this in mind, the context that God has called Isaiah to be a voice for his people and that they're actually consulting other things, then we get this amazing promise which now Bethany is going to read for us.
A reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, verses 1 to 2 and 6 to 7. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this.
So the first verse talks about the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, which has been the one that was most affected by the attacks from the king of Assyria. And it talks about also Galilee, and it's all basically the same land. And what God is saying is, this land that is actually going through the biggest hardship is the one who's going to see the biggest light. And that's because Jesus is going to have most of his ministry there. And it's a really fascinating prophecy over not only the land of Galilee, where Jesus is going to come, and who were actually going through a really hard time. It's a fascinating prophecy for them to realize that actually the light is going to come. And I love it that already here we're finding that Jesus is very different to what everyone expected, because his ministry is not going to be at the center of the kind of Israelite nation. It's not at the center of even the religious, which was much more in Judah. It's actually in a place where it's the margins and unimportant. The ones who have been most affected are the ones who are going to receive the king and the light. So let's look at verse 2, and it says, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." And this is obviously talking about Jesus coming, and we'll see kind of more detail afterwards. But it's just reminding them that this is going to happen, that a light is going to come to this place, and it's going to come through Jesus. And if we go further on, this is my favorite Christmas passage of all. And it says in verse 6 and 7, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end." And Isaiah is just prophesying and sharing who Jesus will be and how will he be. And actually for everyone reading this up to Jesus' death and resurrection, they found it very hard to interpret. But I'd like to look at a few amazing things that we find in this passage. It talks about Jesus' eternal government of peace and justice and righteousness. And I would like to specifically look at the names that are mentioned here, because it's a bit of a description of who Jesus is, and it picks up a few names, and every name is connected with a promise of what Jesus would bring. And we see firstly that it says he's a wonderful counselor. And again, that starts breaking the idea of who God is. God as a counselor, as the one who gives guidance, as the one who's close to them. But not like an oracle that just kind of gives you a little guidance, but actually a counselor is one who journeys with you, who is with you as he counsels, someone who walks alongside you. And the fact that in the Old Testament it's already talking about God this way is so revealing of who God is. And then we obviously have a mighty God, the other name, which obviously has to do with he's big and powerful, but also that the Son is God. There's a bit of a Trinity there already. Then we have the name of Everlasting Father, which is really powerful, because the concept of Father for them was the concept of God as Father. And Jesus being the Father again brings that idea of him being the same God, different person in the Trinity, but the same God. And it gives that idea of intimacy again, that idea of being part of the family. And then we have the name of Prince of Peace. And I think that seems to be the outstanding characteristic of Jesus. He's the one who brings peace, brings reconciliation, gives us inner peace, but also brings peace to others. And one thing that's fascinating about this is that if you read it in Hebrew, we read it in English, and it's got all these commas, so it seems like it's four different kind of names: Mighty Counselor, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. But actually in the Hebrew, all the words are stuck together. There's one word after the next. So actually, how you would read it in Hebrew wouldn't be as we read it, but it would be actually, you'd read it this way. You'd read it, as you see on the slide, you'd read it saying Everlasting Father, Wonderful, Mighty Counselor, God. It wouldn't be like four different names. It's all one. He is everlasting, and he is Father, and he is wonderful, and he is mighty, and he is Counselor, Prince of Peace, and God. And it's all in one chunk, and it's just a big description of who Jesus is, who the promise would be. And all of this just gives us an idea of what Jesus promises to bring to us. But I'd like to ask Nico, who's here with me. Nico, what are the promises of God you tend to hold on to? What are the things that you hold dear in your heart when you kind of come to Jesus?
I think for me, the core always is Father. It's the fact that he is close, he's near. And like for me personally, one of the biggest promises of God that I cling on to is Jesus' words in the Gospels where he says, "Seek first the kingdom and all of this will be given to you." In the context of like he's just talking about like look at the birds and look at the nature and like how God sustains the nature. Wouldn't God sustain you as well? And just trusting that God is my source and God is my provider, even when I don't see where my next month, he is my provider. He will take care of me as I choose him, and as I put him first, he'll take care of the rest.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because when we talk about the provider and he takes care, it's not only money. Like it's not only he's providing physically for like I don't know, I need to feed and I need shelter. Yeah. It's more than that, isn't it? Maybe how do you feel he provides for you in a more emotional or spiritual way?
Yeah, exactly. And like he provides us with a community and with people to journey with and to share with, and like moving to another country without any safety network. That was my like, God, you have promised to take care of me, so I trust you will find me. You help me to find the places for fellowship and communion and everything. Yeah, it's so much more than just money.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think sometimes we tend to look at, and especially certain groups of people tend to look at God's promises as if they were like just heirs of a rich person, and in a way it's a bit like, what can I get out of this? Like what is there for me in this? Like what can I gain from this? And I think that's a fair point, because we are part of God's family. But when I look at God's promises, I see also a lot of him saying that he will finish what he has begun with us, that we can be part of a massive group of people who are trying to change the world and make it a better place. He promises to give us a purpose and the fruit and gifts of the Spirit to help others out. God promises to extend our frontiers if we engage with him. And I think basically God's promises, he does promise an abundant life where we are fighting for a cause that's worth fighting, where we are bringing his kingdom, where we have a purpose to play and a part to play in his team, where we actually, what we do actually matters, and we can kind of change the world. And that really draws me to God, actually. It draws me to his promises, draws me to trust him. The fact that it's not only about what I can gain from kind of this relationship, but it's actually, as we journey together, we are doing amazing things together. And that kind of helps me to want to know God better and trust him, and to pray and to get excited about what he is doing. Because there's a very well-known song in Argentina where this guy says, God is like a kind of supermarket employee. He gives when he receives, and I think that's such a horrible image of God, the God that we go and try and do a transaction where we kind of we do something expecting something kind of from him, or the other way around, or he does something but he's expecting something from us, when actually it's such a loving relationship where we get to journey with him, where we get to kind of live out his purposes. And a friend of mine became a Christian actually when he came to a youth event, and he saw a sign on the wall that said, "Together we can change the world." And he said, he was so moved by that. He thought, I want to change the world. Here's a group of people who want to change the world. I'm getting on board. And he became a Christian. He's been a really committed Christian for a long time, just because he was able to engage with something that gave him purpose, something that's bigger than looking at promises just in a kind of transaction kind of way. And actually, I think we forget that even in this passage, the promise is Jesus. The promise we are offered is Jesus. We are offered freedom and grace and abundance, true living, and the purpose that comes from knowing him. But the promise God is giving them is, what I'm going to send is Jesus. This is what I have for you. And that's enough. And that's the amazing bit of Christmas, is that the promise is him. It's a relationship with him. And I remember, this was a long time ago, we had a worship night in my church, and this is like more than 10 years ago, and I was praying, and I was quite a deep time of prayer, and I was thinking, like, what are my dreams? And God, I want you to just accomplish my dreams in a way, and I want to put my dreams forward to you. And after praying for a while, I realized that my dream is him. My dream is Jesus. My dream is just to connect with him and do whatever he wants me to do. And I think God's dream for us is that our dream is Jesus, that the promise is Jesus, and that's enough. And I think, like, some days we need to be reminded just that God is with us. All we need to remember is that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And sometimes we need to be reminded that, well, actually at the end of this life we have eternal life with him, where all our problems and our sadness will leave. And sometimes we just need to be reminded that God will provide for our future. But other days we need to be reminded that God's promise for us is an abundant life, living out his cause, fighting his cause, being part of this amazing kingdom, having a purpose, having something that to live for that's really worth living, and knowing that he promises that we can take part of it, that what we do matters, that our life can affect other lives, and that we can bring Jesus to others, that we can live out his purposes in our lives. So for me, if I think of what has God promised, and in this passage, what did God promise us? More than anything else, he promised Jesus, and that's more than enough. And Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful." Let us hold on to that promise, for he who promised is faithful. And I just want to encourage us to think of this, and whether you are you just need to be reminded that God is with you, or you need to be reminded that God will provide for you, or you need to be reminded that you are part of something that's really changing the world, that's making the world a better place. Regardless of where you are, just to remember that the one who promised this is faithful, and hold on to those promises. So I'm going to invite us now just to spend a few minutes in prayer, and let us trust, engage, surrender, love, follow the one who is mighty and wonderful and Father and Counselor and God, Prince of Peace, everlasting. And that's Jesus. Simply Jesus. Simply and completely Jesus. That's a promise we have received. So let's just pray and engage with him wherever you're at.